All right, I wanted to do I want to do a video, an audio engineering class part, video 5 part 1. And what I want to talk about is how your DAW correlates to actual the real gear in the studio setting. For example, I got my camera face these ADATs. These are ADATs, which has about 8 tracks each. So with 3 of these, that makes it a total of 24 tracks. Now in the DAW, you can start off with a template that will set you up with according to the template. It could be 8 tracks, 16 tracks, or whatever. You know how many tracks is, based on the template. Or you can start off with a blank one and have no tracks, and then you just build your tracks as you need it. That's what most people do. They'll start off in their DAW and they'll just start building tracks according to their needs. Some people may need 10 tracks. Some people may only need 16 tracks. Some people may need as much as 40 tracks. Some people have as much as 60. It just depends on. It really depends on the person. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about this part because I'm going to talk about the editing portion a little bit in part 2. So that's usually where you're going to start off with the tape machine in your DAW. But what happens is as you build your tracks, it will build the mixing console as you build your track. So when you go to the mixer window in your DAW, it should have built the same amount of channels in the mixer as you built for tracks. Almost every DAW does that. So they're building the mixing console for you. I'm just going to just talk a little bit about how when you build your tracks, like for example, this is already set because I got 3 machines. I also have a 24 hard disk recorder over here. So this is a 24 disc hard disk recorder right here. And that's just below my audio interface. That's what I normally use, the audio interface, to go right into the computer. But as a 24 track hard disk recorder, and then over here, this is ADATs. So there's 24 of them. I have 3 more machines, so I can build, each machine is 8 tracks, so I can make 32 tracks, 40 tracks, 48 tracks, but I really never need no more than just 24 tracks for what I normally do when it comes to recording. But because I don't really use the ADATs machines or the hard disk recorder that much, because I record into my computer, I'm just using the AD to DA converter, the Antelope AD to DA converter. For my Mac, I'm using these 896 HD hard disk recorders. So when you build, let's say I built 48, let's say I built 24 tracks that I've built for recording into the DAW. And it's time for me to, after I've done my recording, it's time for me to start, doing my mixing and all that. As it builds my mixer, I'm going to basically every DAW will build the mixer, how the mixer looks is different according to different DAWs. For example, Ableton Live's mixer looks different than Reason's mixer, versus Reason's mixer looks different than Logic Pro, and then Logic Pro's mixer looks different than Studio One, and you all get the picture. Pro Tools, everyone's mixer look different. The one thing that they all have in common is faders. In DAWs, though, they almost always give you the ability to give you an arm function to arm the tracks to record it next to the fader section. Unlike like for ADATs as an example, where you physically come over here and push the button to arm it, they put it around a fader. That's what most DAWs do. Now, what can be confusing is, let's talk about the signal flow of what's going on in every mixer, because every mixer is different. Sometimes you can get some programs, they're only going to give you the fader portion of your mixer only, and then they might give you the ability to insert some plugins. We call them outboard gear, outboard gear, but they'll give you the option to insert outboard gear, meaning plugins on that, and then they also sometimes they give you the ability to send out, meaning auxiliary sends. Like these are auxiliary sends out. It's the same thing, except in a DAW, most of the time your auxiliary sends to be able to send out isn't there. You literally have to add it in. It won't be there. Like this one's already fixed. I got 10 auxiliary sends. 1 through 8 is mono, and then 9 and 10 is stereo. So that's fixed on an actual console. But these wouldn't be there in your DAW. You have to add them in. So this will be blank. And then a lot of DAWs with the EQ section, like this is the EQ section. Some DAWs, you have to literally click on it to engage the EQ, or you literally have to insert some sort of EQ because it won't be there. Like for example, Studio One and programs like that, and Ableton Live, they don't have an EQ in their mixer. They don't even have auxiliaries in their mixer. You have to add them in. But some other DAWs like Cakewalk and Harrison Mix Bus, they do have, if you get the 32C version of Harrison Mix Bus, they will have the EQ, auxiliaries, and all that. Another thing that won't be there in most DAW mixers is bus volumes, like bus groups. Bus or group, it's the same thing. So most of the time, in most mixers, you're gonna have you'll have just a fader with the ability to mute, with the ability to, like this PFL acts also as a solo, with able to solo, mute, pan, and then a lot of times you have the ability to arm, and they also give you some automation in some DAWs where you can write and read. So you have W and R. And sometimes they'll also give you what they call monitoring, where you can hit a little monitor button to listening to what's going on. On a real console, you don't need to have a monitor button because in your DAW, you need to engage the monitor so it sends an output signal out of the interface to your speakers. Well, on a real console, you don't need to have a monitor button because you're already listening to your speakers coming from your monitor. Like, for example, this would be your monitor volume, so you would be listening to your monitor volume to your speakers on a real console. But so that's what's going on. So a lot of times you'll just have just the fader, and then a lot of times in your mixer, according to real console, this has bus assignments. But you had a lot of times in your DAW, you won't have bus assignments. You just have to add your bus groups by right-clicking, and then it'll have you the option to add. Some DAWs give you the option to add auxiliary sends, which means if you can add auxiliary sends, and then some of them also give you the auxiliary to add some bus groups. Like this, they're fixed. This one's already on a real console, they're fixed. I just have to engage it, and it'll send to these bus groups that are already there. In a DAW, they're not fixed. None of this is fixed. You have to literally add it in by, sometimes you have to go up to the top of your DAW. Sometimes you have to go right click. It just depends on your DAW. And it allows you to add that in. So most of the time, and a lot of DAWs, the EQ won't be there. You have to add it in. Some DAWs do give you EQ, like Cubase gives you EQ. You just have to click on it. Luna also gives you EQ, but some DAWs like Ableton Live, Studio One, they don't give you EQ or auxiliaries or bus groups. You have to add all that stuff in. And then sometimes, you know, on the console, they'll say gain. Some DAWs will say gain or trim. It's the same thing. And sometimes the trim volume knob is not at the top like it would be on most consoles. Some DAWs, the trim volume is where the fader's at. So it really depends. So you can kind of, like this, you can see these lines. These are kind of sections. So you see the line here, then there's a line there, then there is a line here. See the line there, then there's a line. These are all sections. Like you would see in your DAW, you would see maybe at the top, like in Cakewalk, they have the gain knob / trim knob like they would on a real console. And then some DAWs will allow you to do the polarity changing at the top. Some will allow you to do closer to the fader. You just have to look at your DAW's mixer. But other than that, a lot of times they'll give you 48 volts to change the polarity and all these different options, filter controls. Some DAWs don't. So it just depends on your DAW's mixer. But a lot of times you will have, so the signal flow is usually going through the trim / gain section or the preamp section in your mixer in your window. Then the next portion, if you don't have an EQ, it's definitely not going to have auxiliaries there. Most of them do not. Some mixers do, like Harrison Mix Bus and Reason. They do have auxiliary sends, and then some, but most DAWs don't, like Logic, Pro Tools. They don't have auxiliaries or bus groups. You have to add it in, and then after that, you have your pan, solo, and all that. So, because you have to add auxiliaries in, and bus groups, and in some cases even an EQ section, you have to add it in by inserting a plug-in EQ. Some DAWs give you EQ, and then, you know, so it just depends on the DAW, but that's how they correlate. But one thing that's in common, other than the signal flow, it's definitely going to go from the preamp, and if you have the ability to send it through an EQ, if you just engage it or add it, and then it's going to go to your fader to come out. And then the master. So a lot of times when you open up your project mixer's window, you'll, depend on how many tracks you built. Let's say you built 24, like this has 24 fixed already channels there. Then a lot of times it'll have the master output. You'll see that a lot of times they're on the right. You can have that. Sometimes they give you the ability to move to the right. Like if you're in some, you know, just depends on your DAW. 90% of the master output is going to be on the right side of the screen. And here, it's in the center of this console because this is basically 48 channels. You got 24 on the left, 24 on the right. But the master output is here. This is the master. Or it may say main. Most DAWs say main. Most DAWs say master, because that's your master bus. So you hear that term, what are you putting on your master bus? They're talking about what are you putting on your master. So this is the master bus, but on mixers, they don't call them masters. They call them mains. It's the same thing. Main or master. So this is the master here. These two, left and right master. Master output or the main output. So other than adding in your EQ if you need to, or insert a plugin if you need to. So it's going to go through the trim level. Sometimes the trim level is at the top. Sometimes the trim level is near the fader of your DAW. It just depends. So it's going through the trim level, and maybe give you some options to change polarity or 48 volts if you're dealing with. But most of the time you won't usually see 48 volt on the channel because that's going to be engaged by your audio interface. Depends on the audio interface that you're using, or if you're using a preamp, an external preamp that's going to go into your audio interface an external preamp would have 48 volt to engage for a condenser mic. And then a lot of times, some give you the option to do like high pass filter. Like this has a high pass filter engagement. Some of them do not. Sometimes you have to do a high pass and low pass filter through your EQ section of your. If your DAW has an EQ section, it also gives you the option to maybe do high pass and low pass filtering at the EQ section as well. Most mixers, they usually separate it. It just depends on the DAW. So it's coming from the preamp section into, if you engage the EQ, then it'll go through the EQ, then it goes to the fader. On real consoles, some of them have just a set of main faders. Some have dual faders. You just have to, it give you the option to switch between main, and it just depends on the console. You can switch between the small faders and big faders. It just gives you that option. But some consoles like this, where it doesn't have a second set of small faders, it's got one set of faders. Most DAWs are every DAW is not going to have small faders. And that's going to be a different video on why some consoles have small faders and why they have dual faders on the channel. That's a different video. So that's generally how it's flowing. If you understand that it's flowing the same way it would in a real console, it's going to flow that way in your DAW. Then you'll know what's going on with your mixer in your DAW to use stuff. So let's say you're open, and I'm going to do, this is part 1. I'm going to do part 2, and I'm going to actually pull up some DAW windows so you can see what I'm talking about. The great thing about DAWs is you don't have to worry about any weight you don't have to worry about any heavy consoles or patch bays or cables. That's the great thing about it. Because real consoles with real outboard gear, you need a patch bay with cables. Like I got my box of cables down here, and I got my patch bay over there, because you have to hook all your outboard gear to a patch bay to get it into the console. The console's heart is cable connected with all the outboard gears. Heart is connected to the patch bay. But in your DAW, you don't have to worry about it. Your plugins are in some folder somewhere on your hard drive. That's where all your plugins are at. So all you gotta do is go and your DAW, tell your DAW to locate that folder. Then you can open up your plugins window and just slide or drag or insert or right click or whatever into the DAW. You don't have to worry about trying to patch it in. So it's going to flow through the preamp section of your mixer in your DAW. Then it's going to go to your fader unless you engage in EQ. And then a lot of times the DAWs will give you an option to insert a piece of gear as if you were inserting on an actual real channel. You insert the same way in your DAW, like a dynamic processor, like a compressor or a gate or something like that. And then it gives you the option, from there you're going to your fader, where a lot of times, because you don't have your DAW is connected to in your DAW, the recording is connected to the mixer. So when you switch between the mixer window to the tape machine window, when you open up your DAW, that's why they give you the ability to arm the track. In a real situation, on a real mixer, there is no arm per channel. You have to go to the recording source and engage it. That's why I have something like a remote control, where that's why you'll see things like the transport controls, stop, fast forward, rewind, locate, the time, and all these different things. And then you have the ability to arm and do all these different things at your controls. But that'll also be on your screen on your DAW. They'll give you the transport controls. You'll see that in your DAW, and your ability to arm, except most of the time, instead of arming here per track on the controller, they'll be usually by the channel. So that way you can switch between the windows. That's normally how they do it. Other than that, you just have to add in your auxiliaries, and that adds in your auxiliaries And most of the time, some consoles give you send and returns. Like this would be the returns inputs for returning from a piece of gear that I sent through an auxiliary, like a reverb or a delay. If I sent it out the auxiliary on the output of the console, on the back of the console, it's usually going, it's going to a patch bay, but then that patch bay is going to the piece of gear that I want, like reverb units. Like I got my reverb units over there. And those, the returns from those, which is going back to the patch bay, I can patch it in. So I got my returns patched to channels. I can send it here, because if I don't patch it to channels, it'll automatically come back to the return here on the console. But in most DAWs, when you add in the auxiliary, you have to add in your auxiliaries. You have to literally add them in most DAWs. When you add them in, they will automatically create another channel, another regular standard channel. But instead of saying what channels 1, 2, 3, 4, or whatever you name the channel, most of them will automatically name it auxiliary. Sometimes you have to name it auxiliary. It just depends on the DAW. But that's what it'll do. So if I had 24 channels and I need to add some auxiliaries, when I add, like for I got 8, so now over here I have 8 auxiliaries returning on these sets of channels over here. And your DAW will do that. So if I add one here, it can add one to send, and also now I got auxiliaries here. They do that because that's how mixing engineers do it on a real console. They will actually, like an SSL console or consoles like that, APIs or whatever, they will send out the auxiliary, send it to like a reverb unit, like I got over there, and then the returns will come back to channels. That's so the DAW programmers knew this, so that's why most of them set up, when you create an auxiliary channel, it makes it another channel, and that's where your auxiliary returns will come from. But the thing is, when it does make the channel, nothing to be there, because you have to insert the reverb or delay on that channel. You have to insert it on that channel for the reverb or whatever piece of effect processor that you want to do. You literally have to insert it or take a plug-in and add it in. That's what you have to do. That's the only really difference. Unlike here, if I send an auxiliary out, I have to patch it in. I got patch cables there, and those are going to all my sends. Then I can start using my reverb and delays here because I got them patched in. You just have to cably patch it in a real situation. But in the DAW, you don't do that. You just, when you create your auxiliary channel, it'll create a channel. Then you just have to go to the insert section of your auxiliary channel that you just created and bring your plug in on that channel. And it'll work the same way if you're working on a real console. The only other thing is, on the channel here, we got bus group assignments. Some consoles, the bus group assignments are next to the fader. Some consoles, the bus group assignments are at the top. It does the same thing. It just depends on the type of console. Except in a DAW, there is not going to be no bus group assignments. You just have to right click or whatever, add in, or go to the track, add in a bus group. Depends on your DAW. You had to add your bus groups. When you add them, it'll also make standard channels that look like normal channels. Instead of it saying auxiliary, it may say bus. Or you can rename that bus group. But on a real console like this one, the bus groups are already fixed. That's why they're red. Or the knobs are different colors. And then you have your bus groups that are assigned. Then it makes, but these are already there. They're fixed. So you just have to assign them. But in your DAW, you just have to add them in for your bus groups. And then here, because these are my bus groups, now I can send my bus groups. So now I can send a channel, instead of going to the master or the main output, I can send it to a bus group. This channel will then go to the bus group. Then I can send it from the bus group to the master out here. It gives you the same option in your DAW's mixer. The only one other additional thing that you will see in a mixer in your DAW's Wind mixer was you will see input and output routing, because a lot of times, sometimes they give you the option to, like this. These are already fixed. They're already either going to go to the master here, or they're going to go to bus groups here. But in some DAWs, it gives you the option to send the output directly, depending on how many outputs that your audio interface has. Like my Antelope has 32 inputs and 32 outputs, so it'll give me the option to send 32 out. I can send it directly to the output of that output connection on the back of my interface, and I can assign it to just come directly out of the interface that way. But some people's interfaces don't have that option. Some people's interfaces only have 2 inputs and 2 outputs, like a Focusrite 2IT only got 2 inputs and 2 outputs. So your DAW, when you set up in your preference window to see your audio interface, it's only going to set up based on how many channels your interface has, inputs and outputs. So if you only got 2 inputs and outputs, you're not going to be able to send, change the routing. But it gives you the option to do inputs. So it tells you how many inputs that your interface has. You can tell it where the input source, and that's what you want to do. And the output will automatically default to the master output in the DAW. And that's kind of what you want to do, unless you're doing something like me, who's got, let's say, 24 outputs coming out of my audio interface. I have those coming through my patch bay into 24 inputs, 1 through 24. So when I am mixing, I go to the output section of the routing on that channel and tell it and redirect it to go channel 1 of the track. I tell it go out channel 1, channel 2, channel 3, all the way to 24 on the output routing. And instead of it coming through just the master output of my interface, it's going to send through all 24 outputs, which are coming to the channels. And that's, you do that option. So that's another thing that's going on in your audio interface or your DAW, as well as the routing to redirect the signal as well. But and if you're working in the box and you're just going to work and you're going to mix everything through the mixer in the DAW, then you want to keep it defaulted to master or bus groups to the master. Channels to the master or channels to bus groups to the master. That's how you want to do it. So if you're going to send these channels to bus groups, then you can send from the bus group, then it's send it to the master. That's how you want to do when you're working in the box. But if you're working out of the box, then you want to just change the routing outputs to come out depending on how many outputs your audio interface has. That's how you want to select if you're going to use a console that has multiple channels like this one. So that's going to do it for this one. I'm going to do it, continue to talk about it in part 2. And to give you an idea, to show you part 2, what I'm talking about, how your mixer's signal is flowing in part 2 of this video series. All right, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.